On 6 April 1945, along the Werra River in central Germany, elements of the 4th Armored Division advanced under overcast skies, pushing northeast toward Gotha, 30 miles west of Erfurt. The local terrain flattened into open fields broken by low forest. Tracks of Sherman tanks and half-tracks cut deep lines into wet soil from recent rain. The division had been moving without pause for days, stretching fuel deliveries and exhausting drivers. Among the armored infantry riding in support was a 26-year-old staff sergeant in the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion, posted to the lead company. His men carried standard M1 rifles and carbines. Light machine guns remained mounted on the vehicles to conserve strength for possible resistance. No one expected significant organized defense. Scattered Volkssturm units had been dissolving under pressure from the American armored thrusts. The sergeant's priority was to maintain contact forward, secure road junctions, and avoid becoming fixed by last-ditch German positions. The battalion's immediate assignment was to approach Gotha from the southwest, bypass pockets of resistance, and prepare entry routes for armor. Civilian movement in the area had been increasing, complicating traffic discipline. The sergeant noticed local residents standing behind hedges or at gates, neither hostile nor welcoming, only watching. The war around them was collapsing, yet these towns appeared orderly, roofs intact, shops closed but unlooted. It created an atmosphere of suspension, as if the countryside refused to acknowledge the front's proximity. Near Ohrdruf, 12 miles short of Gotha, aerial reconnaissance had noted a compound of unknown purpose. At first, the division staff assumed it was an ammunition dump or communications site. The area was ringed by low woods and rail spurs, an arrangement suitable for military storage. The 89th Infantry Division, advancing parallel to the armor, reached the perimeter before the tanks. Reports of scattered rifle fire came back, not from organized troops, but from guards attempting to flee. Less than an hour later, the line companies reported the position secure. The staff sergeant arrived by half-track in early afternoon. The gate stood open. Beyond it lay rows of barracks, sheds, and drill squares. Lime pits had been dug into disturbed soil behind the structures. The air carried a heavy odor he could not place. Prison uniforms lay in piles near the administrative building. He saw bodies lining a yard, some partly covered with earth. Officers reminded the men to keep spacing, avoid unnecessary handling, and watch for potential mines. Ammunition magazines were still partly filled. The guards had abandoned everything. What the infantry found was the subcamp Ohrdruf, part of the Buchenwald concentration system. The facility had held forced laborers, mostly political prisoners, but also Soviet POWs. Many had been driven out on evacuation marches when the front approached. Those left behind could not walk. The medical supplies were insufficient for even minimal treatment, and dysentery had spread unchecked. The staff sergeant recorded the details in his notebook because his battalion commander ordered accurate descriptions for later reporting. The notes included distances between pits, approximate body counts, the presence of hastily built gallows, and the absence of functioning sanitation. When General George S. Patton, commander of the U.S. Third Army, arrived 2 days later, on 8 April, the weather had turned warm. He traveled with elements of his staff and accompanied by General Omar Bradley and General Dwight D. Eisenhower, who sought first-hand evidence of enemy conduct. As they moved through the facility, they observed the same lime pits the sergeant had noted. Patton stepped back from the bodies and covered his face briefly. The inspection remained disciplined. Measurements were taken. Statements from liberated prisoners were recorded through interpreters. The senior commanders concluded that local German civilians could not have been unaware of the camp's purpose. Rail traffic passed nearby. Labor detachments had worked on surrounding infrastructure projects. The decision followed. Civilians from Gotha and nearby settlements were to be brought to the site to witness conditions directly. Patton issued the instruction through local military government channels. The staff sergeant and his section were assigned to escort one of the first groups. On 12 April 1945, a column of civilians, men and women of varying ages, walked the road toward Ohrdruf under armed supervision. They carried no bags. Many kept their eyes fixed ahead. Upon arrival, they were directed past the barracks and toward the burial sites. Army photographers documented their reactions without comment. The staff sergeant stood 10 yards away, maintaining order. He was not instructed to speak, only to ensure that no one attempted to leave early. Some civilians murmured that they had known prisoners were kept for labor, but denied knowledge of executions. Army officers did not argue. They pointed instead to the pits and the partially buried bodies. The purpose was not debate, but exposure. The civilians were to see and comprehend. A detachment of local officials was retained longer. Patton later required the mayor of Gotha and his wife to view the dead. Shortly afterward, they returned home and took their own lives. The report reached the armored battalion as a brief entry in the daily summary. The staff sergeant's focus remained military. His unit continued toward Gotha, encountering minor resistance outside the rail yards. Bridges remained intact. Fuel stocks were discovered in a depot large enough to sustain the division's advance for several days. This logistical gain reduced the urgency of resupply convoys, allowing a brief pause. During that pause, officers distributed new orders reinforcing Patton's directive. Local authorities in liberated areas were responsible for burial duties. Army engineers provided tools, but civilians were to perform the labor. The intention was administrative clarity, not vengeance. Graves had to be dug to prevent disease. For the staff sergeant, the war continued in linear fashion. After Gotha, the armor turned east toward the Mulde River, pursuing remaining German formations. The sergeant destroyed an enemy machine gun nest outside a small village using coordinated rifle fire and a supporting vehicle gun. Casualties on his side were minimal, but the incident reaffirmed that isolated resistance still existed. Each contact slowed the timetable. By late April, the Third Army's advance approached the limits of the Allied boundary, beyond which Soviet forces held responsibility. The staff sergeant heard discussions among officers about halting near the Czech frontier. At no point did combat units return to Ohrdruf. Their mission lay forward. Responsibility for securing the camp shifted to rear-area military government units and medical personnel. The Army's internal memoranda showed that the documentation at Ohrdruf influenced broader policy. Eisenhower insisted on extensive photographic evidence. He later urged political leaders and journalists to visit similar sites so that no one could dispute their existence. The staff sergeant did not witness these later inspections, but he understood from orders and briefings that the Army regarded accurate records as essential. At war's end in May 1945, the staff sergeant's battalion remained in Germany as part of occupation duties. His notes from Ohrdruf with their careful numbers and distances entered the battalion's historical file. He rarely spoke about the site. Silence was common among those who had seen it directly. The legacy of the decision to bring German civilians to Ohrdruf persisted into post-war administration. It established a precedent. Responsibility for burial and sanitation fell to local authorities. It also demonstrated that evidence of systematic killing, once uncovered, demanded acknowledgement. Patton's directive reflected the military discipline of the moment, rather than rhetoric. The objective was clarity. The war required documentation and accountability. The staff sergeant left the Army later that year. His battalion history listed engagements, casualties, and supply statistics. The brief entry about Ohrdruf appeared near the end, noting the first concentration camp discovered by U.S. forces and the requirement imposed on local populations. The record remained concise. In the long view, Ohrdruf became part of a wider historical process. Military necessity opened the camp, documented it, and communicated its conditions. The decision to bring German civilians ensured that the facts were not confined to reports alone. The war in Europe ended shortly thereafter,
but the memory of those pits remained among those who had seen them. The ground around Ohrdruf was leveled and sanitized, yet its significance endured through testimony and record. The staff sergeant never returned to the site. The war moved him forward, and history preserved the rest.
Historical conclusion. Ohrdruf was the first concentration camp liberated by U.S. ground forces. The discovery influenced Allied policy toward documentation and civilian responsibility. Patton's decision to compel local witnesses formed part of the immediate response to evidence of organized killing and neglect. The incident helped establish a factual foundation for future investigations and trials. Its legacy endures as a reminder of what armies encountered when they advanced into Germany in 1945 and how they chose to record it. The administrative consequences of Ohrdruf extended beyond the camp perimeter. In the week following its discovery, Third Army civil affairs officers documented the number of civilians compelled to participate in burial duties. They recorded tools distributed, hours worked, and ground covered. Lime stocks were requisitioned from nearby warehouses. Engineers fenced the area, posted signage in German and English, and assigned guards so that scavenging or tampering could not alter evidence. The process demonstrated how military procedure adapted to conditions that no training manual had anticipated. For the armored battalions still advancing, the episode became a reference point rather than an operational concern. The staff sergeant received only brief intelligence updates. On 14 April, he rode northeast in a half-track that had logged more than 1,500 miles since the breakout from Normandy. The engine required maintenance every 40 miles. Spare tires were scarce. Rear area mechanics cannibalized wrecked vehicles to keep the column moving. Fuel trucks staged at intervals no greater than 20 miles, and each battalion maintained strict accounting because Patton's advance routinely outran depots. Outside Arnstadt, the staff sergeant witnessed disorganized clusters of German soldiers attempting to surrender. They carried no heavy weapons. Many were older men with minimal training. The sergeant's platoon collected their rifles, stacked them, and turned the prisoners over to military police. The process took less than an hour and barely delayed the battalion. The war's tempo was accelerating, compressing distances and collapsing resistance faster than battalion logs could record. 3 days later, the 4th Armored Division crossed the Mulde River. Forward reconnaissance reported that Soviet forces were less than 100 miles to the east. The staff sergeant received orders to halt at designated coordinates. The boundary was political rather than tactical. The halt allowed him a moment to reorganize platoon gear, ammunition belts, rifle slings, blankets, and captured pistols collected from abandoned guardhouses. Nothing in these tasks referenced Ohrdruf directly, yet the event persisted at the edge of military consciousness. Officers no longer speculated about rumor, they had evidence. In late April, Eisenhower requested that congressional delegations and selected journalists accompany him to Buchenwald and other sites. He explained to subordinates that disbelief could arise if documentation were not exhaustive. The staff sergeant heard these points secondhand through briefing summaries. He understood that his notes from the Ohrdruf perimeter, measurement pits, distances between barracks, body counts, formed one tiny contribution to a growing record. The emphasis remained administrative accuracy, not emotional reflection. As the German surrender approached, the sergeant's battalion transitioned to occupation responsibilities. Patrols enforced curfews, guarded supply routes, and supervised the operation of rail yards essential for humanitarian shipments. The sergeant noted that some German civilians referenced the camp voluntarily, usually in brief remarks expressing either denial or resignation. The Americans did not interrogate them. That function belonged to counterintelligence teams.
In June, the sergeant visited Weimar briefly during a courier run. The roads carried steady military traffic. German civilians moved aside without prompting. Near the outskirts, he saw a sign directing authorized personnel toward Buchenwald. He did not enter the complex. Access required clearance and purpose. He remained on the road, continuing his assignment. The war's new phase placed priority on discipline, supply, and control. Sites of atrocity remained under guard for investigators and tribunals. Ohrdruf itself changed hands administratively. Medical teams attempted to assist surviving prisoners. Graves registration units standardized burial locations. The camp's internal structures were photographed repeatedly. Months later, portions were raised to prevent disease and unauthorized entry. The memory of the site shifted from physical terrain to documented record. That transformation followed the Army's larger pattern: record first, sanitize second. The staff sergeant returned to the United States late in 1945. He resumed civilian life, carrying a discharge paper listing campaigns rather than descriptions. In subsequent years, public awareness of concentration camps expanded through trials, testimonies, and publications. The sergeant rarely commented when hearing the subject referenced. Silence remained a form of accuracy. His authority came from observation rather than interpretation. Decades later, historians assessed the decisions taken in early April 1945. Patton's order compelling civilians to view the bodies was documented as a military directive intended to prevent evasion of responsibility. Eisenhower's insistence on first-hand inspection became a foundational moment for the preservation of evidence. The exposure of Ohrdruf influenced the methodological framework for documenting subsequent camps and mass graves. What the staff sergeant recorded as numbers in a notebook fed into a chain of reporting that extended into legal archives and historical literature. The broader operational context remained unchanged. Third Army continued forward until halted at political boundaries. Its advance demonstrated the speed at which modern mechanized forces could collapse a defensive system already strained by fuel shortages, destroyed rail infrastructure, and fractured command. Inside that advance lay the discovery of organized killing, an element the Army had not planned for tactically, but addressed with administrative discipline. In the present, Ohrdruf stands as a documented threshold. It was the first camp uncovered by U.S. ground forces. Its pits, barracks, and abandoned prisoners forced armies to confront what existed beyond declared battle lines. The staff sergeant's presence there lasted only hours. His war resumed immediately afterwards. Yet that brief exposure entered the official record and contributed to a collective understanding that extended far beyond one soldier or one battalion. The legacy remains: acknowledgement based on primary observation, burial conducted under civilian responsibility, documentation preserved for judicial and historical review. The restraint of military language ensured that facts remained intact. Those disciplined records formed part of the evidentiary base that underpinned future remembrance. The staff sergeant's life after discharge settled into ordinary patterns: employment, family, and routine. Yet the written records of his battalion remained stored in archives. In 1946, when tribunals in Nuremberg presented evidence about concentration camps, photographs from Ohrdruf appeared among exhibits. The pits, the corpses, the lime traces across disturbed soil, and the witness statements from liberated prisoners reinforced prosecutorial arguments. Nothing in those photographs required enhancement. The clarity came from simple exposure. Military historians later noted that the discovery at Ohrdruf occurred while the Third Army was advancing at an operational pace that stressed its own infrastructure. Armored divisions depended on daily fuel deliveries measured in tens of thousands of gallons. Maintenance crews worked in improvised workshops, sometimes in open fields. Supply echelons carried rations, medical items, and replacement weapons. The Army did not allocate special units to search for camps. Combat movement uncovered them. That accidental intersection between maneuver warfare and mass detention illustrated how modern conflict could reveal civilian catastrophe within tactical space. In written testimony decades afterwards, soldiers consistently commented on the contrast between the intact towns and the conditions inside the camp. Streets in Gotha carried no visible signs of starvation. Warehouses held inventories catalogued by municipal authorities. Rail schedules, though degraded, still attempted regularity. Yet a short march away, bodies lay in open earth. That contradiction formed part of the psychological weight reported by witnesses, though they seldom used emotional language. Observers described measurements, smells, arrangements of structures, and procedural instructions. Their restraint became evidence. The staff sergeant never pursued publication. His notes entered a collection because wartime records were systematically gathered. The U.S. Army Historical Division requested unit diaries, operational journals, and
agricultural zones resumed planting. Civilians displaced by wartime destruction elsewhere sought housing in the region. The administrative government, first under military authority, later German civil control, treated the site as a documented location rather than a memorial. It took years before organized remembrance emerged. In those early months, priority went to stabilization rather than ceremony. The long-term legacy of Patton's directive towards civilians remained embedded in policy rather than speech. His insistence that Germans confront the consequences of the camp reflected a belief that administrative responsibility must remain visible. Eisenhower later extended that principle by inviting journalists and politicians to observe conditions personally. Bradley emphasized the necessity of documentation in his memoir. Each leader approached the problem from a different angle, but all sought the same outcome: resistance to erasure. As decades passed, historians recognized Ohrdruf as a historical inflection. Later discoveries, Buchenwald, Dachau, Mauthausen, expanded public understanding. Yet Ohrdruf held chronological importance. It was first. That sequence mattered. It showed when the U.S. Army crossed a threshold of awareness. Before April 1945, rumors circulated. After Ohrdruf, rumors became structured knowledge. For soldiers like the staff sergeant, the camp formed only a fragment of service. Their operational priorities remained anchored in distance, time, and fuel. They advanced, halted, secured perimeters, rotated patrols, and absorbed intelligence bulletins. The camp experience intervened briefly, then the war reasserted pressure. That limited exposure lent credibility to their later accounts. They had no time to shape narratives. They recorded facts because facts served operational needs. By the war's end, more than 6 million U.S. soldiers had served overseas. Only a fraction witnessed a camp directly. The staff sergeant belonged to that fraction, not by design, but by proximity. His role was not investigative. He guarded, escorted, and enforced. His responsibilities reflected military order rather than legal inquiry. When he died decades later, his service record identified campaigns, commendations, and discharge status. It did not list Ohrdruf. That absence aligned with common practice. Individual experiences seldom appeared in summaries. History captured events through archives, memoirs, and testimony rather than personnel files. Yet the implications of what he saw extended into juristic history. The burial requirements imposed on civilians shaped the early template for denazification efforts. The documentation of camp logistics informed prosecutors during war crime trials. The preservation of eyewitness statements countered claims of fabrication. Each administrative decision formed a chain connecting battlefield discovery to courtroom evidence. The staff sergeant's last surviving notebook page describing Ohrdruf listed only numbers: approximate bodies visible, approximate bodies partly buried, distance between pits, estimated volume of lime, and the dimensions of 2 barracks. The language was technical. The significance lay in its restraint. That economy of words prevented distortion.
Today, Ohrdruf stands within documented history as a moment when military momentum revealed a concealed structure of violence. The 4th Armored Division did not alter its tactics because of the discovery. The battalion did not revise doctrine. Yet the event effected collective understanding of what Allied forces encountered across collapsing German territory. Tanks crossed rivers, infantry secured villages, and amid those movements, evidence of organized killing surfaced without transition. The record endures. It demands neither amplification nor rhetorical emphasis. Preservation remains the only requirement. Accuracy stands as the essential memorial. The impact of Ohrdruf extended beyond immediate military and administrative concerns. As the Third Army moved eastward into Saxony and Thuringia, intelligence officers compiled situational reports referencing the camp, noting the disposition of surviving prisoners and the presence of corpses. These reports emphasized distances, structures, and logistical constraints. How far each barracks lay from the perimeter fence, the dimensions of burial pits, and the distribution of building materials. No embellishment was permitted. Precision was paramount. This approach reflected broader U.S. Army documentation policy. In a war defined by scale and speed, facts were the most reliable currency. For the staff sergeant, the lingering memory of Ohrdruf manifested in operational habits. His platoon maintained careful records of local civilian movements, noting populations near road junctions and train lines. The Army's philosophy was that human terrain, villagers, displaced persons, and those remaining in towns could influence both safety and discipline. Civilians had witnessed atrocity at Ohrdruf. The American forces now understood the psychological and moral consequences of leaving populations unexposed to the full scope of events. Patton's orders had established a precedent that would ripple through later occupation policies. In the weeks that followed, as units secured towns such as Eisenach and Weimar, engineers and military police ensured that information about Ohrdruf remained contained for official purposes. Surveys documented structural integrity of buildings, rail access, and usable roads. Medical teams treated prisoners and prepared detailed morbidity reports. The staff sergeant occasionally provided raw measurements: length of barracks, width of open areas, approximate number of prisoners per building. These measurements were devoid of sentiment, yet they conveyed the scale of suffering with stark clarity. By May 1945, as the Third Army approached the Czech border, the sequence of events at Ohrdruf became a touchstone in historical review. The staff sergeant, now performing routine patrols and overseeing supply movements, witnessed the coordination challenges inherent in mechanized advances. Fuel shortages, vehicle maintenance, and fluctuating morale among both troops and liberated civilians. Amid these pressures, the memory of the camp was always cataloged in his notes. Numbers, distances, and structural layouts were recorded in pencil on official forms, ready to be incorporated into higher-level operational archives. Historians reviewing Third Army movements later highlighted the significance of this first liberated camp. Ohrdruf's discovery underscored the intersection between tactical operations and humanitarian documentation. The pace of the armored advance was such that most soldiers encountered only conventional military obstacles: destroyed bridges, isolated pockets of resistance, and retreating German units. The existence of systematic mass incarceration required an immediate but controlled response: document, expose, and enforce civilian acknowledgement. Patton's orders had established a precedent that would ripple through later occupation policies. In the weeks that followed, as units secured towns such as Eisenach and Weimar, engineers and military police ensured that information about Ohrdruf remained contained for official purposes. Surveys documented structural integrity of buildings, rail access, and usable roads. Medical teams treated prisoners and prepared detailed morbidity reports. The staff sergeant occasionally provided raw measurements: length of barracks, width of open areas, approximate number of prisoners per building. These measurements were devoid of sentiment, yet they conveyed the scale of suffering with stark clarity. By May 1945, as the Third Army approached the Czech border, the sequence of events at Ohrdruf became a touchstone in historical review. The staff sergeant, now performing routine patrols and overseeing supply movements, witnessed the coordination challenges inherent in mechanized advances. fuel shortages, vehicle maintenance, and fluctuating morale among both troops and liberated civilians. Amid these pressures, the memory of the camp was always catalogued in his notes. Numbers, distances, and structural layouts were recorded in pencil on official forms, ready to be incorporated into higher-level operational archives. Historians reviewing Third Army movements later highlighted the significance of this first liberated camp. Ohrdruf's discovery underscored the intersection between tactical operations and humanitarian documentation. The pace of the armored advance was such that most soldiers encountered only conventional military obstacles, destroyed bridges, isolated pockets of resistance, and retreating German units. The existence of systematic mass incarceration required an immediate but controlled response. Document, expose, and enforce civilian acknowledgement. Patton's orders had established a precedent that would ripple through later occupation policies. In the weeks that followed, as units secured towns such as Eisenach and Weimar, engineers and military police ensured that information about Ohrdruf remained contained for official purposes. Surveys documented structural integrity of buildings, rail access, and usable roads. Medical teams treated prisoners and prepared detailed morbidity reports. The staff sergeant occasionally provided raw measurements: length of barracks, width of open areas, approximate number of prisoners per building. These measurements were devoid of sentiment, yet they conveyed the scale of suffering with stark clarity. By May 1945, as the Third Army approached the Czech border, the sequence of events at Ohrdruf became a touchstone in historical review. The staff sergeant, now performing routine patrols and overseeing supply movements, witnessed the coordination challenges inherent in mechanized advances. Fuel shortages, vehicle maintenance, and fluctuating morale among both troops and liberated civilians. Amid these pressures, the memory of the camp was always catalogued in his notes. Numbers, distances, and structural layouts were recorded in pencil on official forms, ready to be incorporated into higher-level operational archives. Historians reviewing Third Army movements later highlighted the significance of this first liberated camp. Ohrdruf's discovery underscored the intersection between tactical operations and humanitarian documentation.